Hi everyone, I'm Dan Elliott and welcome to this video on setting up a Paper2D project in Unreal Engine 4.3. So the first thing I'm going to do is just open up a blank project. I've loaded Unreal Engine 4.3, choose blank projects, I'm not going to choose the starter content, and I'll just call this Paper2D setup. The engine does come with a template Paper2D example, but I'm going to show how to create that from scratch. So we'll just create this project, and you could go in and open up that template and pick it apart and see how it works, but I'm going to just take you through that and see if we can recreate it ourselves. So the first thing I'll do is come to I want to go to Editor Settings, Editor Preferences, Viewports, and I just want to invert middle mouse pan. I just find that a bit easier to navigate around the viewport. So what we'll want to do is we want to get some content that we can import into our level, into our game. So I have gone to opengameart.org and I have found this Sprite sheet from Clint Bellinger, and it's a pretty basic sprite sheet with some animations in there. It's got a run, it's got a stance, block. I'm just going to use a couple of these, but it's got a few more in there if you wanted to go and use it as a test sprite sheet. So just go ahead and download this, and I will save this into a folder. And what we want to do is open this in Photoshop, and we want to make sure that it's got an alpha, because Unreal is going to use that transparency information to extract those sprites from that texture. So we'll just open this in Photoshop, and if we come to the channels tab, we can see it hasn't got an alpha. So the way that we can create that is if you control click on the layer on the little thumbnail, it will select all the opaque pixels in that layer, and we can come down to this little icon here in the channels tab, click it, and it will create the alpha for us, and we can have a quick look at that. If I control D to deselect and then click on the icon, we can see that it's now created an alpha for us. So we're just going to re-export that as another PNG, and I'll just save that as another file. So now we can close Photoshop and go back into Unreal, and we're going to create a new folder and call this Sprite Texture. And we will import that into that folder. It says that it's not a power of 2 texture, so we won't get any maps, but that's okay. We're not using it as a 3D texture. We can just take a quick look at this in Unreal. Depending on the kind of style of your game, you might want a really high-res texture for the base of your characters, or you might want to be going for a 8-bit or 16-bit style game. If you want an 8-bit or 16-bit style game, it's probably best to come to texture, open this tab, and change the filter settings from default to nearest, and that will cause the texture to not filter between the pixels. If it's set to default, it will probably do trilinear and we'll get blurring between the pixels. But if you want that pixel look, choose nearest, and then you'll retain this look where we see the pixels. The other thing to keep in mind is we want this to never stream to be ticked on, because if it's turned off, then Unreal will try and optimize this texture and stream it in and out of memory, and we might get some artifact and downsampling. So make sure that this is turned on, and we shall save that. So now we have a texture, but we want to extract this texture into the individual sprites. And the way we do that in Unreal is we right click on the texture and we simply just click extract sprites. And that will go through and detect where all the gaps are and automatically create these sprites for us. And if we hover over, we can see that the type of asset that this is now is a sprite. So we can go and save all them. Yeah, we'll just go and save them as assets in our game folder. And if we want, we can even put this in a subfolder just to keep things organized. So I'll just select these and move them into this folder. So now we have our sprites. We want to find a way to be able to animate these. And the object that we use to do that is if we right click and under the animation drop down, right at the bottom there's a sprite flipbook. So we can create a new sprite flipbook. And this is what's going to be containing all of the animations for the different types of movements our character is going to be doing. So the first one we'll do is we'll create an idle, and we can double click that to open up the flipbook editor. And what the flipbook editor does is it takes in individual sprites and it allows us to play them back in a timeline, and we can edit that to make sure that our animations are looking correct. So if we go into our Sprites tab, the way that we import sprites into the editor is we can either create an element manually by clicking this plus button, and that will create one down here, and we can click on this sprite tab here and choose the sprite manually, and we can delete this by clicking this little bin if we want to. Or we can come to the content browser and manually drag in to the flipbook editor. So now I've dragged in one sprite and it is one frame of our flipbook animation. For the idle animation, I'm just going to keep this static pose, but for the next one I want to create a walking animation. So now we need to create another flipbook. So let's create a second one, and we shall call this walk. And we'll double click to open up the flipbook editor, and now we need to choose the sprites that's going to be our walk animation. So let's rearrange some of these windows so it's a bit easier to see. So I can already see that one of the sprites has been brought in a bit of a mess. So if I double click this, it's going to open it up in the sprite editor. And we can see that it's tried to collapse two sprites into one, where it hasn't been able to detect the gap between them. So what we can do is we can come up to this tab over here and choose Edit Source Region. It will automatically show the whole texture in the context of all of the individual ones, and it will show you the region of where it's extracted that one. So what we can do is click on these points and move them and fix where this individual sprite is going to be picking from the original texture. And I've got snapping on here, so I'll turn off snapping, and that will allow me to get the source region to be a lot closer to where I want it to be. So we can click save, and now if we look into the content browser, that sprite has been updated and fixed. While I'm here, I'll quickly look at the sprite editor. This sprite list in the bottom right hand corner shows you all of the sprites which are created from a common texture. So these are all the sprites that come from this original sprite texture that we imported. If we wanted to, we could come and create new sprites and use that to pick new regions in that texture, and it would show up here. So other things we can do in the sprite editor is we can change the ratio of pixels to Unreal units. So if I double click this, it's going to open it up in the sprite editor. And we can see that the ratio of pixels to Unreal units If we have a sprite that is, say, 20 pixels wide and 100 pixels high, and we want those pixels to take up 1 unit each in Unreal, then the ratio should be set to 1, and that would mean that 1 pixel equals 1 Unreal unit. If we set that back to default, which I can't remember what it was, but 2.56, if we set that back to default, that will change how these sprites are scaled and how Unreal will interpret them. So now each pixel will take up 2.56 Unreal units, and that allows us to kind of resize our sprites. If we wanted to go for an 8-bit look, then we'd probably keep this at 1:1 so that we can have a fixed resolution in terms of our Unreal units. So we'll just save this and exit the sprite editor. We'll go back into our flipbook editor for our walk animation, and we're going to look at our sprites, and now we're going to create our walk animation. I'm just going to come to the view options in the content browser and bring the scale up so it's easier to see which sprites I need to drag in. So I want to drag these in the right order, but unfortunately it seems to extract them not from right to left in the way that they were laid out in the sprite sheet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pause the video and work out the order that they're meant to go in, because they're kind of jumping around here and I want to make sure that the animation is going to look correct. Okay, so I've worked out the order and I'm just going to drag them in the order that I worked them out. So we're just going to click on this, hold, and then drop it into the editor here. And I'm just going to go through and choose them correctly. Okay, so I think that's okay. It's looking a bit jerky, but for our demonstration it won't matter that much. So we'll just save that, close the editor, and we can go to our folder above, and yeah, that's looking a bit jerky, but that won't matter. It doesn't stop us showing how it's going to be used. If you're doing your own sprites and animations, I'm sure you can work out how to get the animation to be smooth and choose the right ones. Anyway, moving on. How do we get these flipbooks and animations into a character? Well, 4.3 comes with a new kind of inbuilt character that we can use to use these flipbooks, and it's very closely related to the character that comes in the third-person blueprint and even the first-person blueprint. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new basic asset, create a new blueprint, and instead of making it based on a character, which is what most things would be based off, we're going to come to the custom classes and search for paper, and we can see under pawn and character there's a new class called paper character. This is a class that's based off of character but is tweaked a bit to have the ability to use flipbook animations. So we'll choose that, hit select, and we'll name this paper character, and just make sure we save that. So we can double click this to open the blueprint editor, and let's have a look at what it comes in with by default. So it comes with a character movement component, and this is the same character movement component that's in the standard character class, and it has a lot of the same properties. It has all the same properties that that character class has. So we can change how high it can jump, the friction, the max walk speed, all those kind of things that affect the movement of the character. It also comes with a capture component, which is what is used currently to provide collision for the character so that it can bump into obstacles, jump around on platforms. If it hits an enemy, we can find out if it's done that, and we can take damage. It's got an arrow component, which is just a visual way of seeing which way the character is facing. And here's our sprite component. If we just hover over, we can see it's a paper flipbook component. This is a component which lets us render flipbook animations and parent it to our character. So all we need to do is come down with the flipbook component selected, come down and choose our source flipbook. And by default we're just going to choose idle. And now we can see in our viewport we can see that is now rendering. So now we have a couple of options here. In terms of our collision for our character. One option is that we can get our capture component. So we have a couple of options here when it comes to collision for our character, and it just comes down to taste really. If you want to have your sprite unscaled, and if you're going for a 8-bit or 16-bit style game and want your pixels to have a 1-to-1 ratio between pixel units and Unreal units, then you're probably going to want to leave this unscaled. And we can grab the capture component and we can scale that down to fit the sprite shape. So if we bring the radius down and then the height, I did it in that order because if this was big and we tried to bring the height down first, it can only come down as far as the radius is. So I set the radius first, and then we can bring the height down to whatever we want. So I'll just choose a value like that. And I have noticed a bit of bugginess with this when editing this in the Blueprint component editor. And sometimes I'll change a value and it won't update in the viewport. So if I just do a quick compile, exit, and reopen, and go back to the Components tab, then when I come back, things should be a bit better and reset themselves. So I'm going to set the height to match the sprite. If you're not worried about pixel units to Unreal units, and if this was the same as it was, which I think is this, if you've got a high-res texture for your sprite, you can actually scale up the paper flipbook component and make it match the height of your capsule. For this, in this case, I'm going to scale down my sprite back to normal scale, and I will set this back to match the character. Okay, I'm just going to compile, reopen, just to reset that bug. There we go, so that should do for our purposes. We'll just save that. And now we can actually get our character, make sure we save it. We could if we wanted to. I'm going to come to front view by hitting this little drop down here, go to front view. And we can actually drag that into our game to preview how that's going to look. If we want to show it lit, we can do that. And we can show how big this character is now in terms of Unreal units. So I'm just going to delete that quickly. And what we're going to do now is we're going to click on World Settings, get our game mode, and we're going to create a new game mode. And we can just call this Paper Game Mode. And what this is going to allow us to do is choose the default character that's going to be spawned in our level. And we can choose the one we've created, which is Paper Character. And now, wherever we have our player start in the level, our Paper Character is going to get spawned. One thing you definitely want to do before running this is just come to your Blueprints folder, and in the game mode that we created, we want to just make sure that it's been compiled with the paper character chosen, because otherwise it won't use that as the default character. And currently we're not looking at our character from the viewpoint we want to see it at, because the camera that is being used is the one from the player controller, and we want to create our own camera so that we can view our character from a side-scrolling point of view. So we'll just exit out of here, we'll go back into our character, and what we're going to want to do is create a new component. So with our capsule component selected, we're going to click add component, and we're going to add a spring arm, and we can just call this paper camera arm, and we can now see that we've got a spring arm in our blueprint character. And because we want to be able to see this from the front, we want to rotate this around so it's viewing it from this angle pointing towards our character. So I'm just going to rotate this 90 degrees, and now that spring arm is pointing towards our character. Now at the end of the spring arm, we're going to want to create our camera. So we'll add a component and we'll add a camera. And we can see that it's created at the origin, and this isn't where we want the camera to be. We want the camera to be at the end of our spring arm. So if we get our camera, click it and drag it under the spring arm, it's now parented to it, but it's still at the original position. And if we look at the transform, we can see that the transform has been offset so that it stays where it was when we dragged it onto the spring arm. So what we want to do now is zero the transform out. So now it inherits the transform of the spring arm, and we can see that now it's in the right place, pointing towards our character. And the other thing we want to do is select our camera, and we want to tick off this use controller view rotation, because when we go into our game we want to explicitly tell Unreal, no, please use the camera we've created and use that rotation. So we'll compile that. So now if we hit play, we should see that our camera is correctly pointing at our character, and we can see our character being rendered. Now it won't actually be moving because we haven't set any input axis mappings or action mappings, and we haven't connected that up to the character controller yet. Briefly, I want to just adjust the camera of the character, because at the moment the camera's quite far away, and I'm just going to show you a couple of options that we can change. So if we come to the camera and scroll down in the details panel, we can see there's a perspective mode or an orthographic. Now a perspective mode is going to give you what a normal camera would give you, with a field of view. If we have an orthographic, that will be more like a 2D game where everything's flat and will appear as if it's on layers. So I'm going to choose an orthographic, and I'm also going to get my camera spring arm, and I'm just going to reduce the target arm length so that the camera is a little bit closer to the character. If we have orthographic chosen, then the distance of the camera to the character won't really matter, as the orthographic width will determine the size of the render view. So if we set a render view of 1024, then when we hit play, that means that 124 units will be chosen as the width of the render view. So if I come back and change that now to something smaller, like if I change that now to 256 and compile and save, and we hit play, then 256 units is now the camera view. But we can also see that any 3D geometry, we can't see that now because it's an orthographic view. We're seeing that from side on, and we're not seeing any polygons being rendered. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up for this part of the video, and in the next one I'm going to show you how you can connect up your character in the blueprint graph so that we can have him moving around and jumping and switching animations. Thanks for watching.